I woke up to the sound of crackling flames. At first, I thought I was dreaming, maybe picturing a campfire or a summer barbecue. But the thick, suffocating smoke curling through my bedroom window told me otherwise. My chest tightened as I kicked off the sheets and sprinted to the window. And that's when I saw it. My motorcycle, my police-issued, state-owned motorcycle, engulfed in flames. Right there in my own driveway. Fire consumed the frame, flickering hungrily across the pavement like some kind of hellish ritual. For half a second, instinct kicked in. I lunged for the fire extinguisher. But even as I stumbled toward the door, I knew it was pointless. The flames were too high, the damage already done. The second I stepped outside, the heat slammed into me, searing against my skin. Bare feet against cold pavement, smoke filling my lungs. But beneath the shock, something else was rising. Fury. Then I heard it. Laughter. I turned my head toward the house across the street, where a small group of people stood watching. Wine glasses in hand, smug grins on their faces. They clinked their glasses together, celebrating. My jaw locked as the realization hit me. The HOA board. Right in the center stood Mrs. Pennington, the ever-so-smug president of this suburban nightmare. She leaned toward the others, whispered something, and then turned toward me with a self-satisfied smirk. "Next time, follow the rules, Mr. Dawson," she called out, her voice laced with mock concern. For a moment, I didn't move. Not out of fear, not out of shock, but because my mind was struggling to grasp the level of insanity I was dealing with. I had encountered criminals, dealt with reckless drivers, even arrested the occasional lunatic. But never, not once, had I seen suburban homeowners commit an outright felony over something so utterly stupid. 2 days ago, these same people had shown up at my door with a welcome letter, a piece of paper wrapped in a threat. The Homeowners Association, or as I had come to think of them, the neighborhood mafia, had made it crystal clear that joining was highly encouraged. Their smiles were fake. Their tone was rehearsed. The entire interaction made my skin crawl. They wanted control. Over my property. Over my home. Over where I park my own damn vehicle. I had politely declined, thinking that would be the end of it. I was wrong, because the fines started rolling in. First, a notice about my grass being half an inch too long. Then another, this time claiming my police motorcycle, a state-issued law enforcement vehicle, was apparently non-compliant with HOA regulations. According to them, it needed to be stored out of sight. The fine? $500. I had laughed at that one. Laughed, then tossed it straight in the trash where it belonged. I wasn't part of their little suburban dictatorship, and they had no actual authority over me. Apparently, it didn't take that well. The fire department arrived within minutes, my driveway quickly becoming a chaotic mess of flashing red and blue lights. Firefighters battling the flames as smoke curled into the night sky. The acrid stench of burning rubber and scorched metal filled the air. And I just stood there, arms crossed, jaw locked, watching in cold silence as my bike, the very machine I had used to chase down criminals, respond to emergencies, and serve my community, was reduced to a pile of twisted, blackened scrap. One of the firefighters, a guy I knew from town, walked over, shaking his head as he let out a low whistle. "Damn, Jack, what the hell happened?" I exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of my neck. "The HOA happened." His brows shot up. "You're kidding." I didn't answer. Didn't have to. The tension in my jaw was enough of a response. Because I already knew exactly who did this. The security cameras on my property had captured every damn second. Hours later, when the fire was out and all that remained was a heap of charred wreckage, I sat in my living room, reviewing the footage, fingers tapping rhythmically against the table, watching, waiting, and then there it was, the entire damn HOA board, creeping onto my property in the dead of night. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes at the grainy black and white footage. One of them, a balding guy in a sweater vest, poured gasoline over my bike like some kind of lunatic. Another, a woman I recognized as Mrs. Pennington's right hand, lit the match. My eye twitched. There it was. Video evidence. They had just set fire to a police vehicle. Not just any police vehicle. A state-owned law enforcement motorcycle. A felony. A massive felony. And the best part? They had no idea who I really was. Sure, they knew I was a cop. Maybe they assumed I was just some low-level patrol officer with a bad attitude and a grudge. But what they didn't know, I was a state trooper. I had jurisdiction far beyond their little suburban fiefdom. And they had just committed a federal-level crime, right under the nose of someone who could personally drag them into court and set their entire world on fire. I leaned back in my chair, arms folded behind my head, a slow smile creeping across my face. Oh, they had really screwed up this time. The next morning, as the sun painted the sky in soft hues of orange and blue, I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching the usual morning gathering at the community garden. The HOA board, self-proclaimed rulers of the neighborhood, were deep in their daily gossip session. Mrs. Brown, still dressed like she was campaigning for office in her signature pearls and power suit, caught sight of me. A smug smile spread across her face. "Such a shame about your motorcycle," she called out, her voice laced with fake concern. "Maybe next time you'll reconsider following the community guidelines." I smiled back, a slow, deliberate grin, all teeth, no warmth. "Oh, I definitely will," I replied, my tone light, almost playful. "In fact, I'd love to have a little discussion about it, with all of you." I took a step forward, pulling out my badge and flipping it open just enough of the sunlight to catch the metal. Mrs. Brown's smile froze. Then it vanished altogether. "The station," I continued, watching the blood drain from her face. The rest of the board stiffened, their earlier confidence evaporating like mist under a scorching sun. "You see," I said, savoring the way her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, "since you and your little committee decided to commit felony arson against state property, I figured a proper sit-down with some of my colleagues might be in order." The color in her face had gone from pink to ash. The other members shifted uneasily, like kids caught passing notes in class. Mrs. Brown took a step back, then another. "See you soon," I said, flashing one last grin before turning on my heel and heading back inside. Oh, this was going to be fun. They were panicking now. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, as the HOA board huddled together in Mrs. Brown's driveway. They were whispering, gesturing, throwing nervous glances toward my house. Just yesterday, these were the same people who had laughed and toasted their glasses while my bike burned in my own driveway. Now they looked like a flock of startled pigeons, desperate for an escape route. The best part? They still didn't realize just how deep they were in. I had spent the night going through the footage, making copies, preparing my next moves. And yeah, sure, I'd be lying if I said revenge wasn't a nice bonus, but this wasn't just about payback. It was about justice, about making sure these self-important, power-hungry busybodies learned that they weren't above the law. They had spent years bullying homeowners with their petty rules and ridiculous fines, believing no one would ever challenge them. They were wrong. By mid-morning, my phone rang. Officer Martinez. The second I picked up, he was already laughing. "Jack," he wheezed, "you mean to tell me a bunch of retired PDA moms and golf dads committed first-degree arson on a state trooper's bike? Oh man, this is gold. Tell me about it. You want me to file the paperwork?" "Already on it," I said, watching the board members scatter like ants. "But I could use a little backup for the next part." The HOA meeting? I smirked. Wouldn't miss it. At noon, I strolled into the community clubhouse. The room went silent. Every single HOA board member was seated at their polished mahogany table, looking at me like I crawled straight out of their nightmares. Mrs. Brown sat in the center, her face carefully composed. But the way she gripped her pen, white-knuckled, told me everything I needed to know. The others shifted in their seats, suddenly far less confident than they'd been when they were setting my property on fire. "Mr. Dawson," Mrs. Brown finally spoke, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" I took my time walking toward the table, letting the silence drag. Then, with deliberate ease, I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward them. The footage played in crystal-clear quality. Gasoline, the match, laughter, the explosion of flames consuming my bike. Someone let out a strangled gasp. Mrs. Pennington looked ready to pass out. I raised an eyebrow. "I think we need to have a little chat." The man in the sweater vest, the same guy who had been a little too enthusiastic with the gas can, shot to his feet. "This is outrageous," he spluttered. "You can't just—" I leaned forward, voice dropping into something deadly calm. "Sit down." I stood with my arms crossed, watching as the HOA board huddled near the community garden, their usual morning gossip session now tainted with an air of unease. Mrs. Brown, still dressed like she was running a political campaign, caught my eye and gave me a smug, triumphant smile. "Such a shame about your motorcycle," she called out, each word dripping with mock sympathy. "Perhaps next time you'll think twice about disregarding community guidelines." I smiled, a slow, deliberate grin, the kind that sent predators running. "Oh, don't worry," I replied smoothly. "I plan to discuss it at length, maybe even down at the station." Her fake confidence wavered. "The station?" I pulled out my badge, letting the sun glint off it just enough for her to see. The effect was immediate. The color drained from her face, her carefully constructed poise shattering in real time. The rest of the board members stiffened, suddenly far less sure of themselves. "Yeah," I continued, watching her swallow hard. "Seeing as how you and your little group committed felony arson against state property, I figure we should have a real conversation. Maybe with a few of my colleagues, the ones who specialize in putting people behind bars." Mrs. Brown took a shaky step backward. The rest of the HOA board looked like they were watching their own funeral play out in real time. I let out a quiet chuckle. "See you soon, folks." With that, I turned on my heel and walked back inside, leaving them to stew in their impending disaster. Oh, this was going to be fun. By mid-morning, the HOA board had descended into full-blown panic. From my porch, coffee in hand, I watched them whisper in frantic clusters outside Mrs. Brown's house, throwing worried glances in my direction. The same people who had laughed while my motorcycle burned now looked like cornered rats. And the best part? They still didn't understand just how deep they were in. I had spent the entire night reviewing the footage, making copies, and preparing my next steps. This wasn't just about payback, though I'd be lying if I said that part wasn't satisfying. This was about justice, about making sure these power-drunk busybodies finally faced real consequences for their actions. My phone rang. "Officer Martinez." I answered, already grinning. "You mean to tell me," he said, barely containing his laughter, "a bunch of nosy suburbanites committed first-degree arson on a state trooper's bike?" "Oh yeah," I replied, stretching out of my chair. "And they filmed themselves doing it." Martinez let out a low whistle. "Man, this is going to be fun." He assured me the paperwork was nearly done. Meanwhile, I prepared for the next step, attending the HOA meeting. I wasn't about to miss this. The community clubhouse was packed. The same place where they had probably toasted my misfortune was now filled with nervous, pale-faced HOA members pretending this was just another routine meeting. As I walked in, the room went silent. Mrs. Brown sat at the head of the long, polished table, her expression carefully neutral, but her grip on her pen was so tight her knuckles had gone white. I took my time walking up, letting the silence stretch between us. "Mr. Dawson," she said finally, forcing a brittle smile. "What a surprise. To what do we owe the pleasure?" Without a word, I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward them. The footage played in perfect clarity. Gasoline, a match, flames, their smug little celebration afterward. A strangled gasp came from somewhere in the room. I crossed my arms. "I think we need to have a little chat." The reaction was immediate. The balding man in the sweater vest, the same one who had gleefully doused my bike in gasoline, shot to his feet. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "You can't just—" "Sit down," I interrupted, my voice dropping into the same tone I reserve for criminals. He sat. Mrs. Pennington took a shaky breath. "Mr. Dawson, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for all this." "Oh, I'm sure there is," I replied, leaning back against the table. "Please enlighten me. Why exactly did a group of suburban homeowners think it was a good idea to commit felony arson?" Dead silence. I let it hang for a moment before continuing. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, keeping my tone almost casual. "In about an hour, officers will be arriving at your homes with arrest warrants." A fresh wave of panic swept through the room. "You see, unlike you, I don't make up rules and fine people for existing. I actually enforce real laws. And setting fire to a state-owned police vehicle? That's a big one. So congratulations. You just turned your little HOA into a full-fledged criminal organization. A woman clutched her pearls like she was about to pass out. The guy in the sweater vest was sweating bullets. But Mrs. Brown, she was still clinging to her delusion of control. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual authority. "This is a misunderstanding." I smirked. "Oh, right. You accidentally poured gasoline on my bike. You accidentally lit a match." She licked her lips, scrambling for a defense. "You're blowing this out of proportion." I leaned in just slightly, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell you what, why don't you call my captain and explain to him why you thought it was a good idea to destroy state property? Maybe he'll go easy on you. Maybe he won't push for the maximum sentence." Her composure cracked. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for support. There was none. The other HOA members had finally realized she had led them straight into a disaster. And then, right on cue, the doors swung open. Officer Martinez strode in, looking entirely too amused. "Good afternoon, folks," he said, his grin barely contained. "I've got some paperwork here with your names on it." And then, absolute chaos. Some tried to argue. Some tried to run. One woman actually fainted. None of it mattered. One by one, they were handcuffed and escorted out, their protest drowned out by the sound of justice catching up to them at last. Martinez clapped me on the shoulder. "Man," he said, shaking his head, "I've seen a lot of dumb criminals, but this takes the cake." I let out a laugh, watching as Mrs. Brown was shoved into the back of a squad car, still screeching about how unfair it all was. "Yeah," I said, stretching out in the afternoon sun. "It really does." The neighborhood was finally free. And damn, did it feel good. The gasps from the audience were audible. Even the judge had to pause for a moment before shaking his head in disbelief. Mrs. Brown tried to argue that it was all just a misunderstanding. She claimed that they were simply trying to enforce community standards and that my refusal to comply had left them with no other choice. When that didn't work, she shifted tactics and tried to play the victim, claiming that they had been intimidated by me and that the fire was an accident the judge was having none of. "You expect me to believe," he said, rubbing his temples, "that 6 grown adults accidentally poured gasoline onto a police motorcycle, accidentally lit a match, and then accidentally stood around laughing while it burned?" Mrs. Brown stammered her carefully rehearsed words. Failing her, the judge didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the jury, who didn't even need to deliberate for long. The verdict came swiftly: guilty, every single one of them. Sentencing day was even better. Some of them got probation, hefty fines, and community service. A few, including Mrs. Brown and her closest lackeys, got actual jail time. She had been so certain she could talk her way out of it. But the moment the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, reality hit her hard. The woman who had ruled over this neighborhood with an iron fist was now just another criminal being escorted out of the courtroom. The fallout from the case was massive. The HOA was effectively dissolved overnight, with most of its board members behind bars or too ashamed to show their faces in public. There was no one left to keep it running. The community held a vote, and in record time, the HOA was officially disbanded. People celebrated like it was a national holiday. Someone even set off fireworks in their backyard, something that would have earned them a fine just a week earlier. The best part, the funds that had once been used to pay for the HOA's ridiculous rules and enforcement were now being put to better use. After some discussion with the neighborhood, we decided to turn the old HOA office into something useful, a community park, but not just any park. It was going to be a barbecue and gathering spot, a place where people could enjoy their own property without fear of being harassed over fence heights or the color of their front doors. I made sure to personally oversee the demolition of the HOA office. Watching that building get torn down was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Gone were the endless stacks of fines, the patronizing newsletters, the ridiculous regulations about mailbox styles, and their place would be picnic tables, a grill station, and a giant sign that read "HOA Free Zone." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same land that had once been used to control people was now being used to bring them together. The first community Barbecue was a massive success. Families who had been at odds for years over petty HOA disputes sat together laughing, eating and enjoying the freedom they had, fought for even some of the police. Officers who had helped with the arrests showed up. Martinez included. He took one look at the banner I had hung over the grill station and burst out laughing. You really named this the anti-Y cookout, he said, shaking his head as he grabbed a plate of food. Damn right I did, I replied, flipping a burger. Gotta make sure no one ever forgets what happened here. People started sharing their horror stories about the HOA, trading tales of absurd fins and power-hungry board members. One guy talked about how he had been fined for having an improperly shaped flower bed. Another told a story about getting a citation because his trash can was visible for exactly 3 minutes past the hose strict pickup window. The more stories I heard, the more I realized just how much people had suffered under their ridiculous rule. But now they were free. As the sun started to set, I sat back in my chair, watching the community come together in a way it never had before. Kids were playing, neighbors were talking, and for the first time since I moved here, I actually felt like I belonged. Then out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a new face, a guy probably in his 40s walking around the park looking at the setup. With interest, he eventually made his way over to where I was sitting and extended a hand. Nice place you got here, he said. I just moved into the neighborhood. Name's Greg. Jack, I said, shaking his hand. He gestured toward the banner. So what happened to the old HOA? I chuckled, glancing around at the happy, relaxed crowd. They had a little accident with fire. Greg laughed, clearly thinking I was joking. Well, sounds like this place is better off without them. Hey, speaking of which, have you guys thought about starting a new HOA? One that's a little more reasonable. I set my drink down, turned to look him dead in the eye, and grinned. Greg, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. The look of panic on his face was priceless. He held up his hands, laughing nervously. Kidding, totally kidding. I handed him a plate of barbecue. Good, now eat before I start writing. Finds. The night ended with fireworks, laughter, and a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. I had moved into this neighborhood looking for quiet, but I had found something even better. I had found a community worth fighting for, and in the end, that was better than any fine free lawn or perfectly measured flower bed. As I leaned back and took a deep breath, I realized one thing: I had won, and damn did victory taste good.